So I'm going to start off with a couple scenarios, and I'd like you guys to just, by show of hands, let me know if you've either directly experienced or perhaps observed any of these conditions in the places where you've worked. So, have you ever been in a meeting with architects and trying to gather information about an architecture, and you sort of wonder, where is this meeting going? How are we ever going to get the information that we need out of this meeting? Anyone ever have that kind of experience? Yeah, yeah, okay. Um, and I think we actually saw this one in an earlier talk. Have you ever thought you've had some agreement with other kinds of stakeholders about the architecture, and then after you've left, you discovered that things went off in a direction different than the one that you had expected? Anyone experienced that? Okay. Have you ever been in a meeting about an architecture and you look around and think, there's like a cast of thousands here. Where did all these people come from? Anyone have this experience? All right. And lastly, have any of you been in organizations where it felt like the primary way that architects are trying to influence the organization was by way of gates or other kinds of mandates? Anybody see those? Okay, so I saw lots of hands go up for at least one of those. And Dave and I really believe that all these situations are examples of a lack of partnering within an organization. So we're going to talk about this afternoon is what do we mean by partnering, and then we're going to take a look at each one of these particular scenarios in some more detail and explain what strategies we might use to address them and some of the pitfalls that you might encounter while trying to do so.
I don't think this works.
All right, we'll just do it that way.
So this is really not a pad of paper. This is a teleprompter. So I just want to take you back to the 1990s. I think you'll remember it. It's the time when the caveman picks up a PC and throws it into the air. Yeah, trumpets are playing in the background, and it's I think it was the movie 2001. So we're going back to the 1990s. And I don't know if you remember, but HP at the time was kind of quietly taking over markets. And somewhere in the background was this software reuse practice. And word kind of trickled out a little bit. Anyway, I had the opportunity to interview the person who was in charge of the program manager for their software reuse initiative. Nobody knew from the external who he was, but I had a chance to talk with him. His name was Ron Grace, and Ron told me that when he first started the job, he said, I thought this was going to be, I'd be delving into technology day after day, learning new things every day and trying to make sense of it. But as you can see from his statement on the board, he learned an awful lot about organizations. And one of the things that just struck me about that conversation was that he said, before a program wants to learn software reuse, we make the key people take a course on partnering. When you think about it, they're trying to share products across organizational boundaries. Maybe it makes sense. And so our talk, we feel that even though it's way, way back before even Cisco was popular, the lessons make sense no matter even new technologies, new methodologies, and so on. So we wanted to share some of these observations with you. So this is a definition of partnering. It's not a vision. We studied leaders in software architecture, and this is actually what we observed. So partnering is the extent to which architecture stakeholders maintain clear cooperative roles and maximize the value that they deliver and receive. So actually then the goal would be to make the stakeholders partners. So then, of course, in order to do this, how do you do it? Well, the first thing you need to know is who are the most important stakeholders. We've all talked about them, or partners. And then what do you need from them? And then what would it take to get them to produce what you need? And then, of course, how do we build a trusted relationship with them? So why partnering matters? Partnering matters both to the organization and to the individual, right? So we architects can't implement an architecture by ourselves. We have to have leverage. Partnering among the groups within your organization, the product owners, improves understanding, coordination within and across the business. So it's a lateral kind of thing. And it sharpens their anticipation of surprises, because if organizations are partnering with one another, they will hear earlier rather than later about changes that might be taking place. And they'll be more likely to implement small changes that make a difference between whether the end product works or doesn't work. And it makes the work more rewarding. For example, it's really rewarding when say, an IT or business partner says, you know, I know you have my back. I know you're going to, if you speak on my behalf, I know you're going to say the right thing. And of course, it always helps to know who to call when things go really, really, really wrong, and that they'll pick up the phone and that they'll work with you to resolve a situation that might blow up. But if you know the right person to call, it can be diffused rather rapidly. And it works even if you're shy, because I'm really shy. So, but it works for everybody. It's not just the outgoing, you know, extroverts. So, but Dave found this picture, by the way. But partnering is really hard work. I mean, it's not something that you can learn over the weekend. It isn't something that you can acquire over a day. And even if you, once you learn partnering, then if you go to a new organization, I think other speakers have pointed this out, you need to learn the domain. And you need to learn the domain without really pestering the people who live in it. You need to dig into source documents, read about it, and so on. So it's hard work. So here we are. If partnering were perfect, if architecture were perfect, this wouldn't happen. But you go to a meeting, key decision makers go to the first meeting, and then kind of the meeting participation changes. So their organizations are represented, but with different levels and layers of expertise. And as a result, the picture of the universe changes from meeting to meeting. The facts change from meeting to meeting. The process changes from meeting to meeting, so that if this is a discovery activity, and where I live in a organization that has a lot of legacy products, you really need to, the goal is to capture some facts, and you want to get done with it. And it almost, in this case, it just goes on and on and on. So what do you do? So I maintain that simple engineering courtesy is really one way to make this happen. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about the organization that I live in. It's very complicated. There are about, in any kind of one business process, there might be 6 major 100 or 1,000 person organization, business organization, and then there might be, and each one with multiple SMEs. You might have an equivalent technical organization, and you might have multiple, maybe 15 or 20 systems that support. And so understanding one piece requires an awful lot of complexity. You need to, and so in any case, I wanted to tell a story about a very gifted and senior architect that I worked with. So basically, he was studying a very complicated process, and of course these processes, the business processes coupled with the systems, which are coupled with the data, and so on and so forth. So during one of these discovery meetings, we discovered something that wasn't quite right. It was like a surprise. He worked all through the weekend. He had actually a staff of like 10 really gifted architects, but he personally delved into the source documentation. He personally put together diagrams, and he stepped through each business step, talked about how it affected the systems, at least the initial picture, how it affected the technology and so on. And at the end of the meeting, we had some pretty well understood documentation. So just an example, he did his homework. He didn't like just say, okay, so what does this look like? He sized the meeting to get the results. In this case, he had to have more people than you would normally want, but he got all the people that he needed. He did everything possible to make the best use of those people's time, and he documented the results so that the next time that someone studied this very intricate process, they didn't have to start from scratch. Matter of fact, they could stand on the shoulders of people who went before. So, well, of course, you can do this too much. If you're focused on getting meeting results, one thing that can go wrong, you can try to use action items to get people to attend the meetings. In other words, assign them an action item, and they'll know they need to come to the meeting. But if to get to have people doing action items that maybe you should have found yourself, you can lose trust very quickly, and the meetings can become very bureaucratic very quickly. You can over-prepare. You can have a very clear understanding, at least your point of view, of what the process is. And of course, you might not then be listening enough to find out, okay, so what is really happening? And of course, you can be too dominating during the meeting and not let anybody speak, because we're going to get through this agenda, my gosh. Anyway, so there are some pitfalls. Next slide. So, yeah, so everybody smiled when Dave put up this. But lots of things can go wrong. A feature you were counting on was left out. Coordination meetings are full of surprises. I don't want to mention the next one, but sometimes just to get a small feature that maybe people didn't know about when you started can escalate to the very highest level. Yes, well, if you have very, very good PMPs managing various projects, scope is, letting any change in scope is kind of a bad thing. And so if you have an internally focused group, just getting minor changes can escalate to the most senior level. So no surprises. Dave, I wanted to ask Dave to tell an anecdote about someone we saw when we did our interviews.
Yeah, so this particular fellow was a really well regarded technical leader. He got a lot of this most of the most challenging projects that his organization had, and he really worked. Got a lot of success when they had really bleeding edge stuff, really hard deadlines. But what's interesting is they had this weekly meeting with his organization, and whenever anyone had bad news, he would turn to the person that affected the bad news and said, "Did you know about that?" And what was interesting was a couple things. One is that it drove the behavior that you didn't wait to the meeting to share the bad news, that you went to go have the conversation with the person that was affected as soon as you found out about it. The other thing that I thought was interesting about his strategy is that was the power of the question, right? That if there was a set of questions that people knew were going to take place, then the anticipation of the question would often change the behavior of the organization. I thought it was a great expression of this as a way of improving partnering within the organization.
Partnering or else. So, wait 1 second, you moved too quickly. I wanted to tell you a story about a program manager that I support. He's really almost, well, he is an expert at getting partnering within his program. He insists that before any contractors bring any recommendation to him, that they've collaborated with all the other contractors. And small thing, but it ends up with really good proposals. And of course, he also asks that they coordinate with some of the people who are victims of the, that are affected by the product. So it does help. And I can't say enough about that program manager, but also to assign cross-team roles. In other words, you assign 1 or 2 people within your team or project to actually collaborate to do some help with other projects, right? So there's a couple of benefits to that. Well, now you're kind of in touch with those other projects instead of hearing about a change like 2 days before your release. You find out when the change happens. Also, you're helping them, so they're more likely to be helpful to you. So there are some pitfalls. To take the example that Dave gave, well, you could discourage the reporting of critical issues and risks. Need to watch out for that. You could increase the formality and stress of a meeting, and you could end up with too much team-level emphasis on, so that you lose focus on what it is that the team's building, and also drain team resources.
Okay, so for the next scenario that I had opened up with, this question about the meeting with the cast of thousands. Well, how did we end up with so many people in the meeting in the first place? It may be that we just didn't understand who was critical and just invited too many people, right? Sometimes what will happen is that if we're unclear about the agenda and purpose of the meeting, people will invite themselves to the meeting because they're afraid of being left out, or what might come out of it, because there's a lack of clarity. And especially when you have dial-in information, sometimes people will propagate the invite, and suddenly you realize there's like 20 people on the phone, and you're wondering where they all came from. No matter how it is that you end up with too many people, the effects, I think, are generally poor, right? One is that the meetings themselves become less effective because the ratio of who gets to speak versus who gets to listen, goes out of whack. And with more people, including people who might not be as important, weighing in on the decisions, you end up with less effective decisions. So what we can try to do then is try to do a better job of identifying and engaging our critical stakeholders. Value chains is certainly a great way to think about this, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But the key thing about why we want to understand these value chains is who is involved, why are they important to the architecture, and what is compelling about the architecture to them. So we really don't have time to get into value chains specifically, but I want to share a few thoughts that I think that are relevant for thinking about value chains in the context of software architecture. One is, when you find your decision makers, who do they refer to when they're trying to make who do they consult? You can oftentimes find some key fountains of wisdom within your organization if you see who they refer to. We saw some great examples earlier today about what does the data say, both data about the architecture itself and the data flowing through the architecture. That will often tell us where some of the key players are. Even if you know who they are, do they trust you? There's this one organization I've worked with that had some history of making promises and being unable to deliver them. And now that they're doing a whole lot better, those other stakeholders are saying, yeah, I'm not sure you're really going to deliver when I think you're going to deliver. And so you need to have a lot of sort of one-on-one work to figure out what is it that you can do to provide evidence to them that you'll be able to deliver, especially if you've had some history of being unable to do so. And we saw some great examples of the complexity of some organizations earlier. You can't assume that you know everything. No matter how much work you've done to understand it, you need to make sure that you're open to the information that you're going to get from your other partners. And if we do that, I think we can get a better engagement. not just in terms of understanding who needs to be there to be successful, but they'll actually take the actions to be in alignment with where you're trying to go with the architecture. As with all these things, we can do this too much. We can suffer by death by analysis. We spend so much time to understand the organization, we forget to go look at the architecture. You can also have the problem where you have different partners in your your value chain that may have conflicting obligations, and you have to figure out, is there some way that you can split the needle so that they can both be satisfied, or perhaps there's some group that you have to make the decision that you're not going to support because it's in conflict with everything else. And the important thing about the value chains is the information that you're getting. Some folks can get turned off by too many of these little chevrons for your value chain. Don't let the picture get in the way of the real information you're trying to get to. So the last scenario we talked about was this question of sort of mandate-driven architecture. And I think this fails for a number of reasons. One is that if you're in an organization where people are being primarily driven by compliance to some kind of checklist, they're going to think about this in terms of, well, what's the minimal amount of work I have to do to satisfy the check, and not really, well, why are we doing the thing that we're doing? The other thing is that I think in a lot of organizations, the value of the architecture gets expressed in long-term benefits to the organization. A lot of these gates are happen at the ends of cycles, and you're looking right in the face of immediate business concerns. Immediate business concerns against long-term architecture concerns, the architecture concerns are going to get steamrolled every time. So if we wait until the point that we're at the gate, we're oftentimes too late. And so how can we get better alignment with the architecture without trying to rely on these various kinds of gates and mandates? So one strategy I think can work really effectively is to establish a mindset of reciprocity with the other stakeholders. There's this one architecture group that I had seen where they saw the other sort of partners as things delivering pieces of the architecture, but you talk to them about, well, how are they doing? Are these other partners working well with this? And the architects would say, I don't know. And so if you don't have the sense of reciprocity, if the other partners don't feel like they're getting value out of participating in the architecture, then all of the great analysis and so forth, and all the great designs and trade-offs and whatnot isn't going to get you anywhere. This can be part of both formal and informal approaches, but it's going to take time to make sure that you can do this. I think the key part of this, though, is service. And I don't mean service in the technical sense of the word, but a service mindset. Right? How do we as architects see ourselves as serving the needs of the other partner organizations that we need in order to be successful? And I think Dave spoke, I think, really passionately about feeling like people have got your back and feeling like someone's going to pick up the phone. I think that all comes down to this notion of reciprocity. And then, as with all these things, I think we can do them too much. If you get so great at delivering value to the teams, maybe the teams count on you guys to be doing more than perhaps is reasonable. Or the converse of that, maybe the teams start taking on too much responsibility or accepting too much scope when they shouldn't be. And so you need to make sure that it's not that we want to have no scope differentiation, but we want to be careful about that. So at the end of the day, this is really about peer-to-peer relationships within and across your organization, both on the technical and the business side. So as you go back to your respective organizations, think about these questions. Do we know who our critical stakeholders are for our architecture? Do we know what they need? What about our architecture is going to be compelling to them to want to be in alignment with it? And if we have that, do they trust that we'll be able to deliver it? And are we passionate about building upon that relationship so that they'll want to do so? I think I've got about 30 seconds, so thank you very much.
Thank you. And that gives us time for a question or two.
I'm interested to see what impact the partnering from outside the organization. In the company that I'm in, coming in with a partner message and reorganizing the whole architecture team was very heretical and very controversial when I first got there. Now it's an accepted method of practice. What's interesting is how that's translated into affecting the business
So I don't know if you have the one particular case that comes to my mind. What was interesting was the notion of what the organization was going to do to rebuild trust. In this one particular case, part of what it was is just getting to committing to smaller things, right? So they used to have these giant multi-year kind of efforts, and then they were inevitably always late. And then they changed to a model where they were going to deliver sort of core things every sort of quarter and got in a habit of delivering that quarterly thing. And so now those other partners who were really skeptical about that organization's ability to commit, saying, "Oh, these guys have some track record. They seem to be reflecting my concerns." And the other thing about that was that by having sort of more regular opportunities to deliver stuff, there was more opportunity for feedback. So if a partner said, listen, this is a problem for me. I need X, Y, Z, not these things that you've offered. Oh, wait, look, I didn't have to wait 5 years to see that response, and by the time I got that response, it was irrelevant. They actually delivered it in a time that I could actually make use of that. And so it was a slow process, but you definitely could see the change in the attitudinal responses of the other organizations. If you got anything.
Yes, it's infectious. And like anything else, people have toolkits, like the one tool is whine and make a big deal and bring it up in an embarrassing situation, and another, but when the people relax, then of course, then you have a more lateral and more kind of behind the scenes resolution of a problem that could become very difficult.
All right, well, thanks to all our presenters for a great session. Don't forget to vote on your voting cards, and we have a break in the mezzanine area. So, thanks.
Thank you.